special thanks for all as well as thank you to the sponsors for today. But as a sponsor, I can take to thank Everylight Foundation for the work they're doing today, the work they're doing this week, but the work they do all year round to give voice to rare disease patients and how important that is. So thank you for that. As a couple of introductory remarks on the Orphan Drug Act, I think you're going to hear a lot of this is good policy, it's good for business, and it's good for patients. It's one of those rare pieces of legislation. It's something one of the original sponsors, Representative Waxman, called it, I want to get the quote right, good government at its finest, because it really set out to meet the challenges it was going after. So it is good policy. It served as a basis for similar policies in Europe, in Japan, and other countries looking to set up a rare disease framework. And just as one statistic on its success, before the Orphan Drug Act passed, there were 10 approvals for rare diseases. In 2020 alone, there were 32 approvals. And that's out of 59, I think they did that year. So it's just a great mark of success on how this piece of legislation impacted this environment. And it's good for business. I joined this industry 11 years ago. Prior to that, I worked for the Senate for John Kerry representing Massachusetts. And so I got to know the industry as a Senate staffer and then joining industry. And just as a mark of the growth in business around rare diseases, in Massachusetts alone, in the last 10 years, we've seen employment double to 110,000 people working in the industry. If you look at the 5 top companies in Massachusetts, roughly 20,000 people, they are focused on rare diseases either wholly or partly, those top 5 companies. So again, it has been great for business. And lastly, and most importantly, obviously, it's been great for patients. This is not something you need to hear from me, but if you get to work with rare disease patients as I get to, you hear every story is unique. Every story has moments of despair, moments of joy, moments of sadness, moments of hope. And I think we can all say since the passage of the Orphan Drug Act, there's been a few more moments of hope than there was before that. And really, what more can you ask of a piece of legislation? So with that, I want to bring up Frank Sestinowski, who is going to be our moderator today, and very appropriately so. He joined the FDA in 1983 and really worked on the implementation of the Orphan Drug Act while at the FDA. And then since moving into private practice, has worked with countless clients in this space. And as he told me, he's vice chair of the board at Everylight, maybe chair someday, we'll see, you know. And really, truly, was present at the creation of the Orphan Drug Act. So he's the most appropriate person to take us through today. So thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And you know, it's such an honor and privilege for me to be here. I want to say, though, that also if you sat down before the boxed lunches arrived, there are boxed lunches in the back. So it'll even presentation's better if you have lunch in front of you. So as Steve explained, I had the privilege of being at the FDA when the Orphan Drug Act was started. And at the beginning, it didn't really work so well. So there were, the deputy commissioner of the FDA asked me if I could investigate it to figure out why it wasn't working. And we looked into it and we made it work. We figured out, she ended up the head of the Orphan Drug Program at the FDA at the time, Marion Finkel. When I gave her my solutions, she turned to me and she said, go ahead. And she said, thank you, Annie, for telling me. So she said to me, she says, Frank, I'm going to call somebody. She picked up a rotary phone. So this is 1984. She picked up a rotary phone, dialed somebody and said, Henry, we have a problem, but I think we have a solution. And she hands me the phone. And she had me explain to Henry Waxman, you know, how we were going to solve the problems in the original law, which were twofold. And we did solve those problems with the 84 and the 85 amendments. But so I'm saying is that we got off to a rocky start with the Orphan Drug Act, but it immediately took off, like Steve was just explaining. And it's been a godsend to the rare disease community, you know, by incentivizing development, by spurring interest in this community. Our community was not recognized as a community. It was as though we didn't exist. We were orphans. We called it the Orphan Drug Act because we were orphans. We were not even seen in our own communities because we're so rare with whatever one of the 10,000 diseases we have that we couldn't be identified as having any traction. And so the Orphan Drug Act brought us together, said, no, even though each one of our conditions might be few, right now there's a meeting going on at the FDA that I can't be at because I'm here, with a disease that's terribly debilitating for 100 Americans, 100 Americans. And so who is going to pay attention to a disease that affects 100 Americans? But when you put us all together, the 10,000, we become strong. And that's what the Every Life Foundation is about bringing us together. So I was actually looking to try to extend my opening remarks so that we have Congresswoman Matsui, who is on her way. I was told she was on her way here. And so I was going to let her speak first as soon as she comes. So I will interrupt my remarks as soon as I see the good Congresswoman arrive. So we'll go back. So as I was explaining, the hallmark features of the 83 Act is that one, it defined that a rare disease is something that affects fewer than 200,000 Americans in the United States. And my little footnote underneath that was that the original law didn't say 200,000. The original law said to be an orphan drug, you had to open up your books as an industry and have the government kind of look into your economics and see that 7 years of marketing, because you get 7 years of market protection, 7 years of marketing, you couldn't recoup your costs of research and development. Now, that's why one of the things I told Congressman Waxman, one of the reasons why the law didn't take off, because what industry is going to say, I'm going to open up my books to the federal government to look at what are my costs, and then how do you figure what those costs are? So we created instead a bright line test. It wasn't based on economics, but it was based upon 200,000 people. So that made it a lot simpler to implement. The second thing is that it incentivized, as I mentioned, 7 years of market exclusivity, had tax credits, and also had some research grants. The other thing that the original law said you had to do to be designated as an orphan drug is you had to prove that you were not patentable. Now, if you're not a patent attorney, it's a little bit, it's an admission against your self-interest that you're not creative enough to come up with a way to take this invention, this new drug, and to say there's something about it that's not obvious that can be patented. So the original law said you had to be non-patentable to be an orphan drug. Well, so we got rid of that provision in the 84 amendment. So there were very important changes that had to be made with the original law. It wasn't perfect. And there were two things that weren't defined by the original law. And that was, and it was said right at the very beginning, when I started to take drugs to the FDA, and what would happen, there'd be a very small data set. And the very small data set, the chairman of the FDA advisory committee would turn to the senior FDA official and say, what are we supposed to do with this? Normally we have two big studies with thousands of people. Now we have one tiny little study. What are we supposed to do with it? And the only thing the FDA official could say, I felt so bad for him or her, is that we can only say things, well, the 1983 law didn't change the legal standard, the statutory standard. So that was one thing that was not addressed in the original law and is still kind of vexing, to have new development, get out there, have therapies that actually reach patients. The second thing is it didn't define subsets. It said that you are rare if it's under 200,000. But just like the example I just gave you, the meeting that's going on at the FDA right now with the therapy, a gene therapy for a condition that affects 100 Americans, you almost need something for the ultra rare, something that the Every Life Foundation did a research on about 12 years ago. Was that right, Julia, Mark? About 12 years ago, we did research on it and looked at maybe 6,000 as a good cut point. So there are other things that weren't defined in the original law. But in the face of these two limitations, the FDA was undaunted. The FDA said, we're going to turn to principles of flexibility that are in our regulations. So the Congress didn't put it into the original law, But we, as regulators, have something in our regulations that we in turn call flexibility. And that's in a certain regulation that I have there. And also the FDA has another regulation that says, and patients who have a serious disease with an unmet medical need, with no available therapy, they're willing to accept greater risk, safety risk, and greater risk of uncertainty of benefit. And that's in the FDA regulations. So the FDA did something very creative. It applied those to rare diseases. And that's how almost all rare disease therapies get approved. Not because they meet the bright line test of what the statute is, but because the FDA applies flexibility. And the other thing, the FDA did some other things about that. Like the FDA came up in response to the AIDS crisis with the accelerated approval pathway. The FDA, I did an analysis actually of all the FDA approvals, and we showed that 2/3 of them were the result of flexibility being applied. So with this lack of predictable flexibility, because there's nothing in the FDA rules, regulations, or policies that tells an FDA official when they're supposed to apply flexibility or how much flexibility to apply. So it's very undirected, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and it puts pressure, which I think is undue pressure, on FDA officials to exercise that flexibility. So with this lack of predictable flexibility, the FDA, industry, and those persons with rare diseases are all in a fog bank. And Congress has an opportunity to drive life-saving innovations and build upon the pioneering Orphan Drug Act legislation to help clear the fog for everyone. And so my question, especially to those staffers who are here, is who among you in this rare disease congressional caucus is going to answer the cries of our brothers and sisters with rare diseases? So that's the opening overshot to this historic event. I can hardly believe I'm still alive. I've been working on this since 1983. And it's remarkable that we're making so much progress, and we still have more to go. That's it. You know, so it's a celebratory event today, but it's also a call to action that we still have more to do. I'm looking for a signal. If the Congresswoman isn't here yet, then we'll go on with our first speaker. So just confirm. Yes.
Perfect timing.
Perfect timing. All right. We are so pleased to have Congresswoman Doris Matsui. Congresswoman Doris Matsui with us today. Welcome, Congresswoman. Could you come up here? And while you're walking up, I'll say. Please.
Oh my, you ready?
Yeah, we're always ready for you, Congresswoman.
Oh my gosh.
So Congresswoman, I'm just going to say a little thing. Said she represents the city of Sacramento. She's a senior member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and serves on the Health and Energy Subcommittee. So you can see how powerful an influence she can have on these issues with the lately Orphan Drug Act. She's worked tirelessly to improve access to high quality, affordable health care, instrumental in the Affordable Care Act. And she's a strong proponent of incorporating the patient voice in drug development. And one example of that is that in the current Congress, she introduced the Better Empowerment Now to enhance framework and improve treatments, the Benefit Act.
Right.
Beautiful work. Thank you, Congresswoman. So I'm going to now turn you over, and we're so pleased to have the Congresswoman as our new co-chair of the Congressional Caucus for Rare Disease.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Frank, and especially thank you all for being here today. This is really a very special group of people, and I compliment all of you because rare disease advocates have been fabulous for all of us in Congress, and particularly for your support of the Rare Disease Congressional Caucus. Caucuses are important, as you can probably figure out in Congress, because you bring a like-minded group of people who share the same values and can work together and educate each other, sure, but also as a body can also educate others too, which is, you know, Congress has become very large and we have our own special activities, and, you know, sometimes we really need to have another body of people say, wait a minute, listen to us on this. So I thank you very much for advocating on behalf of your families, your friends, and everyone in this country who can really absolutely be helped by what you do. Your collective interest in advocacy has been absolutely instrumental on where we are today. And let me just say this. Many of us are here today because we share a common bond, whether as patients, family members, caregivers, or friends. And our lives have been forever changed by a rare disease diagnosis. Now, personally, my life has been profoundly impacted by my late husband's passing. I can't believe it now, it's 18 years ago. 18 years ago, it's unbelievable. By MDS, which is myelodysplastic syndromes. And it's a bone marrow disorder that can result in not having enough healthy blood cells. And so it's going to lead to cancer or whatever, you can be impacted in many ways. So I deeply understand the unique needs for this community and the challenges we all face in accessing crucial care. This isn't an easy thing at all. When you're reading up and, trying to figure out what is going on. And I know I would have appreciated your support and at that point in time. Now, families like mine depend on each other, and particularly now your efforts to ensure that patients have a voice on Capitol Hill. So for the millions of Americans with rare diseases, we can and must do better. That's why I'm proud to be asked to co-chair the Rare Disease Congressional Caucus. Thank you very much for your faith in me. I really believe that in my experience, when you start working with people who've been profoundly affected, there is that sense of mission there that cannot be found anywhere else. And in fact, what this has done for me is make sure that you can start looking in the hearts of others who have had challenges. Even if not rare diseases, everybody has a challenge, and you can understand what we must do in order to help each other. Now, I know with you, I'm ready to get to work on all the issues that will certainly challenge us. You mentioned the Orphan Drug Act, 40 years, right? This act has encouraged pharmaceutical companies to develop drugs for diseases that are relatively small. But as you know, despite the success of this legislation, there have been fewer than 700 FDA-approved treatments for roughly 550 diseases in the last 30 years. Now, that's why as we look ahead, I want to talk to you about what we're going to be doing tomorrow, the next day, looking forward to the next 30 years, because we want to close this innovation gap. We're in a time of innovation. I also said technology underpins many of the sectors of the country. And in essence, that technology can really help also when we look at diseases. But we need to close this innovation gap for 95% of rare diseases that have no FDA-approved treatment. Now, we know that access to the best medical care is crucial for patients living with rare and ultra-rare diseases. And that's why I've long made a priority to work on policies that will advance the science of rare disease therapies and expand access and care. And many times also, as we're dealing with rare diseases, we find that there are impacts across the board and other diseases too. So this is helpful not only for our particular diseases, but for others too, as we do our research. As mentioned, this Congress, I introduced the Benefit Act legislation that advances patients' engagement in the drug development process. I'm also proud to lead the Access to Rare Indications Act, which is support patients with rare and ultra-rare diseases in getting evidence-based, medically necessary care covered by their health insurance. And in 2023, I look forward to working together with my Caucus colleagues and all of you to focus on how we can strengthen and protect the Orphan Drug Act's incentives and make important progress toward our collective goal to improve the lives of patients and their families. So, as I said before, today is about the actions we'll take for tomorrow and the day after. And to advance in these years, to really advance innovative therapies and eventually cures that have forever changed so many lives. We are at this moment now when science is expanding in so many different ways. We have the opportunities now. We have people who now focus on all the aspects of health. We are focusing on pieces of this in which they're small populations. And many times I know people can ignore small populations, but we can't. Because that small population could be part of our families, our friends, our neighbors, and expand that out. So I say thank you very much. So it's with this knowledge, I believe, and a sense that we all understand that it would take all of us in order to make progress. I stand ready to partner with you as we move forward. I know that you worked before with G.K. Butterfield, who is an amazing colleague of mine. We sat next to each other on the Imaging Congress Committee. And I hope that we can work together as you did, he did. And I know also in the Senate too, there are wonderful people in there too. So thank you so much for allowing me to say a few words and to say how delighted I am to be working with you as a co-chair. Thank you so much.
And you can see we're in good hands. Congresswoman Matsui, thank you, Congresswoman Matsui. That was just fabulous. And the only way that we can follow up with Congresswoman Matsui is with somebody who's a mighty voice herself. And that's Christina Mike. So we're going to have Christina Mike now talk to us. Christina, let me just say a little bit about Christina. She has extensive experience in the rare disease space. She served as executive director of the Undiagnosed Disease Network Foundation and the president of NDLY1, an organization that aims to eliminate the challenges of the rare disease and glycanase deficiency. She was drafted onto the front line of this genomic revolution in 2007 when the oldest of her 3 children was born. One of the trailblazing examples of clinical exome sequencing, Bertrand Mike, became the first patient in the world diagnosed with the rare disease N glycanase deficiency in 2012. Bertrand passed away just shy of 13 years old in 2020, the same year that Christina was diagnosed with a rare disease, myasthenic gravis. She honored her son's memory by working with others to end the diagnostics odyssey for other patients and their families. Christina?
So much. This feels slightly surreal now. It's been, let's see, 5 years. During it, right?
No, it's not. That's an agenda. We don't want that.
Thanks, Fran. And thank you for the kind introduction. I'm so honored to be here. I think 5 years ago in 2017 was the last time that I set foot on Capitol Hill. I think a few things have changed since then. But for me personally, like trying to do the biggest change is that unfortunately my son Buddy is no longer with us. 15th birthday. We celebrated it without him. But if things were different this week, I would be taking him to get his driver's permit and Instead, I'm here talking to you, because I think more 15-year-olds should be celebrating birthdays and getting to see their parents. It was incredibly hard to pull some of the pictures. I hadn't seen some of these in 3 years or so. But the why we are all here is that nobody should have to go or suffer through what my son did, through what my kids did, through what our family did, and still going through, alone or without hope. Fortunately, the Orphan Drug Act has provided a lot. Like Frank said, and the reason I'm here, the reason I got drafted was because of Buddy. He was adorable, just a cutie pie, but when he was born, doctors couldn't figure out why, and cried tears, why he had some movement disorders and seizures. And so I started taking him around the world, around the US, trying to find answers. And we did eventually in 2012. Let's see if I can look at this. We found out that he was the first patient with this particular error gene called NGLY1. And finally, that really led us to start being able to do some science. It led us to find community and to find answers. And actually, we came pretty close to finding a treatment for his condition during his lifetime, believe it or not. And it's worth mentioning, like slight shout out, that none of that would have been possible without the investments that our country has made in institutions like the National Institutes of Health and NIH. It was using that bedrock of science and tools that they developed there. I have to give a shout out to NHGRI and CATS and NIMDS and several other institutes that were phenomenal and did a lot for Buddy while he was alive, and so many others. So for all of those who have funded the NIH, thank you. But science alone does not actually, manufacture and distribute drugs. So what's necessary is for pharmaceutical companies to be interested in developing that. And thanks to the ODA, even though there were at the time less than 10 patients in the world, we started getting pharmaceutical companies actually interested in developing drugs for our kids. Now there's about 100 patients in the world worldwide. And next year in 2023, there's going to be the trial in patients starts for gene therapy for NGLY1. So yeah. We actually got the news on the stuff that we were able to read to him, the news that it had passed the trials in the mice or in the rats, and that it was going to be coming. So that was a good thing to know, but it's one of those things that gives us a great deal of peace to know that this is going to be there for the kids that come after ours. And life with a rare disease isn't easy, and it affects the entire family. Like there are costs that are borne by so many, and there's some fabulous studies that have come out, thanks to Every Life and other people in this room, to really put some numbers around that burden and the burden of the diagnostic odyssey that we knew so well. But my story is a much shorter odyssey. On the surface, this photo looks really cute, like we're smiling. The reality of that photo is that he had just coded a few minutes earlier. And this was in the midst of us, what ended up being a 6-week-long ICU stay. And that was me telling him that he was the bravest, best boy in the world, and that he was so strong, and that he was going to be my little going away present, my little souvenir from that hospital stay was an autoimmune condition called generalized myasthenia gravis. The irony of getting a rare disease while caring for somebody with a rare disease is not lost on me. But what I thought was really funny is that my doctor didn't say it was a rare disease. Most people don't hear from their doctor that they have a rare disease. Unless you explicitly Google for it or try to find the numbers, you might not know that what you have is considered technically a rare disease. All you'll hear is that it might be hard to treat, so there might not be something for you. But that's why we're all here, right? Because I am lucky. I am so incredibly lucky. My rare disease is one that's been around for a while. It's pretty well understood. I was able to be diagnosed relatively quickly from the onset of symptoms. And within days of my diagnosis, I was able to start therapy. I was within 30 minutes of taking a pill for the first time. My vision resolved. I could literally see again. I could speak, I could swallow normally. I could drive again. I got my life back. Thanks in part to the Orphan Drug Act, because one of the drugs that allows me to be here speaking with you today received its orphan drug designation back in 1999. But it was for a different indication. It was actually for a treatment of graft versus host disease. But I'm very, very fortunate that my insurance will cover it, even though it's not technically approved for my condition. Because I need to be there, be here to be speaking with you, and also be there for my kids because they need me. So, and that leads me to kind of this feeling of guilt, but also incredible privilege, because I am capable of standing here and speaking with you today. I'm not in an ICU room. I'm alive. And I'm here, thanks in part because the Orphan Drug Act did what it was supposed to do. It stimulated treatments and therapies that now enable me to live my life and be there for my kids and for those who need me. But obviously, there needs to be more because there's so many more people that aren't as lucky as I am. And for me, I look at this as so much hope. Because the past 40 years, it's not just given us hope for therapeutics, it's given us hope for the future. It's shown that people can and do work together, that there are people in Washington, lots of them, that actually are willing to put people over politics. And that there are people here who care about saving and improving lives. I was actually very fortunate to call Senator Orrin Hatch my senator, and he was one of the original, authors. And maybe this is an incredibly biased opinion, obviously, as a mother patient, but I think that the ODA needs to be expanded. It needs to be improved because, like Representative Matsui said, a lot has happened in 40 years. Technology has changed, science has changed, what we know about the human body has changed. And so there's so much opportunity for innovation in this space. Like, it has done so much good. Why not take this as an opportunity in the next 40 years to make it even better? I'm just a mom, but the person who started this is also just a mom. It's worth mentioning that reminders that this is from Abby Myers. She's ended up founding NORD, but she was one of the driving forces for the original Orphan Drug Act. And she had to fight to get it to pass because it was opposed by the pharmaceutical industry. Like, originally, this was driven by patients and their families, and it still is. I'm up here now because I am both a patient and a family member, and people need hope. And I am so incredibly grateful because, like Abby, she was a mom who fiercely loved her boys and wanted a better future and treatment for them. And for so many others, that's the same thing I want, except I want those treatments to be more of them, and I want them to happen faster and just as safely, but maybe with some of that innovation component intertwined. Because hopefully everybody's 60th birthday next year, we can work on maybe not getting one car, but maybe an expanded and improved Orphan Drug Act. Just throwing that out there. Thank you so much.
That Steve spoke after Congresswoman Matson. Somebody strong who could speak after Congresswoman Matson. You did the job. Thank you. It turns out our next speaker is Ben Shaperman, and Ben is with us today. He serves as the Senior Director of Scientific Outreach and Community Engagement for the Foundation Fighting Blindness. Ben hosts the Eye on the Cure podcast, which provides science information, new insights into the world from the world of vision and retinal diseases. Want to know anything about retinal diseases? Ben's your man. Ben.
Thank you and good afternoon. Just sitting here hearing the stories and the enthusiasm, the will, the power of all the advocates here has just been quite a privilege. It really is a privilege to be here. And I want to thank the Every Life Foundation, Congresswoman Matsui, the other co-chairs, our sponsors, and all of you who have come out to learn more about the Orphan Drug Act and what needs to be done. So again, I work for the Foundation Fighting Blindness. We fund research for inherited retinal diseases, and we've been around for about 50 years. We've raised nearly $900 million for research to overcome these conditions. And the Orphan Drug Act has been critical to attracting commercial investment in the research that we fund. Our role is really to get research to the point where we can attract outside investment, and without the Orphan Drug Act, we just wouldn't be able to do that. So we fund research for conditions that cause progressive vision loss and blindness due to genetic mutations that affect the retina. And these conditions go by names like retinitis pigmentosa, Stargardt disease, Usher syndrome, choroideremia. There are many, and they're very challenging because they're usually diagnosed in childhood, and the diagnosis is devastating. If you can imagine your child being diagnosed with a condition that will make he or she blind. And they progress over time. Sometimes they lead to legal blindness or total blindness. But I wanted to read you a story from one of our constituents who has one of these conditions called Stargardt disease. If you've ever heard of macular degeneration, age-related affects people because they're getting older. Stargardt disease is a form of macular degeneration that affects young people. It's usually diagnosed in children or young adults, and it's progressive. It gets worse over time. So the gentleman whose story I'm going to read, his name is Greg. He's in his mid-30s. He was diagnosed with Stargardt disease at the age of 7. So this is what he wrote. Every morning, I only have to reach for my toothbrush before I'm reminded of all the extra challenges I'll face for the rest of the day, because I'm legally blind due to an inherited visual disorder called Stargardt disease. Then I mentally grit my teeth, hold my toothbrush up about an inch from my eye to gently apply my toothpaste, and start taking on the challenges of the day. One of my biggest frustrations is struggling to connect with people. I almost literally have to bump into my colleagues in the hallway to have a chance of recognizing them. I lack central vision and have to look off to the side to see them. One result is that I don't make eye contact with people, which often makes people uncomfortable and leaves them feeling like I must not want to talk. I groan internally every time I go to a meeting and I'm given a name tag, because I know I'm still going to have to ask people their names and repeatedly endure them responding with blank stares or holding their own name tags up while I explain why I have to ask. As a scientist who travels for meetings frequently, these ego-bruising interactions often come shortly after struggling to navigate unfamiliar airports, trains, towns, and buildings. I rely a lot on a telescope and other emerging devices, magnifying devices that I carry around everywhere, and I need to ask people for help frequently. The tasks I need help with are often so simple that I get blank stares and have to explain my vision problem before people understand what I'm asking for. Even my closest relationships are impacted. My daughter, my young daughter, loves to be read to, but she understandably wants to see the pictures and gets frustrated when I have to hold my head so close to the page to see it. And so she wants her mom to read to her, understandably, and I miss out on the chance to bond with her. He goes on to say, thank God for all the technology I have to make life possible in the face of these challenges. I pray that people will keep investing in research on treatments and technology in the hopes that life will get easier someday, or at least not get harder when my vision loss progresses further. So a virtual thank you to Greg for sharing that story. And I wanted to conclude by mentioning that we're working with a company, a partner of ours called Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, and they develop what's called RNA interference, which is a technology, a fancy genetic technology to correct genetic defects. And excitingly, they're interested in pursuing Stargardt disease. And one approach that they considered was repurposing a drug called vutrisiran that's already FDA approved for a rare disease called ATTR amyloidosis with polyneuropathy. So again, this is a rare disease. But what has discouraged them is because of a clause in the Inflation Reduction Act. This repurposing would make the drug applicable to a second indication, and it would not enable them to be exempt for Medicare pricing negotiation. Medicare pricing negotiation exemption is good if you're just using the drug for one condition. But once you move out for a second condition, then you're no longer exempt. So because of that, they can't move this drug into the phase 3 trial that they had planned. They still want to address Stargardt disease, but they need to develop a drug that isn't as clinically developed and start at an earlier stage. And so that means the drug won't get to patients as quickly, and it will take more research and development to get it into a clinical trial. Alnylam goes on to say that they're very supportive of the Inflation Reduction Act, but just wanted to raise awareness about this one exemption that's so important. They hope it'll be expanded beyond one drug. So thank you for listening to our patient story, learning more about the Foundation Fighting Blindness and one of our pharmaceutical partners. And again, thank you all for coming out today to support the Orphan Drug Act and doing more to expand it in the future. Thank you.
Ben, so now we see a pattern here, but it's going to get broken because Christina was saying, okay, now we got to have for the 16th birthday, buddy, we have to have a new revitalized Orphan Drug Act. We now heard Ben said we got to revise the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, to get rid of that exemption. So, but our next speaker, Dr. Eric Sid, works for the government, so he can't call for changing. So, but Dr. Eric Sid, let me tell you a little bit about him. It's impressive. Dr. Eric Sid is Program Officer in NCAS, the NIH Division of Rare Diseases Research and Innovation, where he is the lead for the Genetic and Rare Diseases Information Center. Maybe you've heard of it, called GARD. GARD provides free, comprehensive, plain language information on rare and genetic diseases to the public and is accessible through both GARD's website and through its contact center. He is the lead also for the Rare Diseases Registry Program. You might know that as RADAR. You know, everything in the government has an abbreviation, so it's GAR, RADAR. And so the RADAR program offers guidance for establishing and maintaining patient registries, which we know is so important to have the natural history. He also oversees NCAT's toolkit for patient-focused therapy development. Dr. Sid, Eric.
So I wanted to start today first by acknowledging the fact that all of us, that I cannot work these slides very well. There you go. That I'm speaking after several really passionate stories. All of us are here today because there are personal stories of those individuals and families that have rare disease that have touched us. And for many of us that work in rare diseases in common, we know that these stories are not unique, unfortunately, that there are many things shared behind them. We oftentimes think of this as a public health challenge of rare diseases as a whole. As an overview, sometimes we will use some of these statistics to describe this public health challenge. There are over 10,000 different rare diseases, but only less than 5% of them have an approved therapy. We understand that this is not an issue just to rare diseases alone. It can take 10 to 15 years for development of a therapy. And oftentimes 9 out of 10 therapeutic candidates that will enter a clinical trial will end up failing, be safe and effective. Now, when we think about this as a whole, what I wanted to draw some attention to was really just some understanding behind this public health challenge and understanding what rare diseases are. What are rare diseases? When we talk about what's rare, different countries classify rare differently. In the US, we use what's called an absolute prevalence, or less than 200,000. In other countries, they have different numbers. Sometimes we use prevalence rates, so in the EU, less than 1 in 2,000, or there is no legislative definition. Oftentimes, when we talk about diseases, our classifications and definitions of diseases can vary. As an example, 11 beta hydroxylase deficiency is one disease with 9 different names. And in addition to that, this example here on the bottom right is a diagram that just shows 2 different diseases with over 90 different genes associated and connected with them. This is for retinitis pigmentosa and Leber congenital amaurosis. So when we talk about these diseases, we can be talking about 2 diseases, or this can really depend on what the purpose that we're trying to talk about these for. If we're talking about these from the angle of gene therapies, this might be 100 diseases. So our definitions really align to our different research or clinical goals that we may have. This is part of the reason why rare diseases are not always included in standard terminologies and codes. And it's hard oftentimes to find information about them. But in addition to that, new rare diseases are identified every year. At the time of the Rare Diseases Act of 2002, there were thought to be 6,000 rare diseases. Since then, our understanding of rare diseases in the last 20 years has only grown. We now know over 7,000, close to 7,300 diseases that have a known molecular basis, a gene that might be resulting in a mutation that then leads to this disease. Our understanding grows continuously over time. And as part of that, this makes it a really complex question when we say, well, how many rare diseases are there? As this number is constantly changing over understanding of the science. There is growing consensus that there are over 10,000 rare diseases right now. And these are 2 examples of recent reports and studies that have looked at this question. Part of the problem here is that there's still a gap between research knowledge and understanding about rare diseases and available therapies. So this diagram here, this graph shows the rate that publications of our understanding of rare diseases have grown has not been met by the number of therapies that have been approved either in the US or in the EU. Part of this problem is what we call a translational science problem. And that's part of NCAT's mission, is really to turn research observations into health solutions through translational science. When we talk about rare diseases in common, oftentimes one of the main issues that affect them is that many rare diseases have an extremely low prevalence. We use the general definition of less than 200,000, but a large proportion of them have less than 1 in 1 million or less than 300 people affected. As an example, that picture over there shows a patient with progeria, which is thought to have less than 1 in 20 million in the world. There's a need. This means there's a need for scalable solutions in rare diseases research. We can't solve this by just focusing on one disease at a time. We have to think about all 10,000 diseases and thinking of where we can find groups of them to create therapies. And this goes back to another issue in rare diseases that's also common with translational science, in that they're not focused just on any one organ, disease, or discipline. There are many different causes behind rare diseases. The majority are thought to be genetic, directly caused by changes in genes or chromosomes, but there are a number of different rare diseases with different causes, infections, cancers, etc. These two issues, this heterogeneity of different disease causal factors and etiologies, as well as this extremely low prevalence, will lead to limited commercial interests and market incentives in rare diseases. And in thinking about how to bring treatments to all research, to all rare diseases, we really need to think about some of our translational science principles. So I wanted to share a couple of programs as examples of what we're trying to do at the NIH. In terms of transforming team science and people that we have in rare diseases research, a longstanding program is the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, which brings together clinicians, researchers, patient advocacy groups, and focuses on multiple diseases at a time. In addition to that, we're also leveraging new technologies. A program called the Platform Vector Gene Therapy Program, or PAVE-GT, is a pilot program that seeks to increase the efficiency of clinical trial startup by using the same gene delivery system and manufacturing methods for multiple rare disease gene therapies. In addition to that, we're looking at the process as a whole, in addition to technologies. The Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortia, which involves the Foundation for the NIH, the FDA, a number of industry partners, as well as patient advocacy groups, is focusing both on those different platforms, as well as some of the questions about manufacturing, about preclinical innovation, as well as thinking about regulatory pathways. And as the last thing to end on, I wanted to focus on big creativity and innovation projects that we're having in terms of the somatic cell genome editing program, which is a common fund project at the NIH. This is really looking at trying to expand the availability of genome editors across many diseases. And it's about to enter its next 5-year phase, starting with clinical trials that will target gene editors across multiple diseases. What I'm providing for you today is just a snapshot of some of the different ways that the NIH is trying to bring together different people, new technologies, and looking at the entire process of how we can potentially bring new treatments to all these different rare diseases as a whole. And I just wanted to end on inviting you to come to Rare Disease Day at NIH in February next year. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk to you.
Eric, we'll all show up February 28th. Make sure you have enough box lunches. And our last speaker is Jamie Sullivan. Jamie Sullivan is Director of Public Policy at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. She joined the Every Life Foundation after spending 15 years with Alpha One and the COPD Foundations. Jamie's work is focused on achieving patient-centered federal, state, and regulatory policy changes in the area of health appropriations, public health infrastructure, and access to care. Jamie.
Hey, everyone. It's hard to follow the excellent speakers we have heard from, especially in hearing the stories that have been brought forward today from patients and families. Like many of you in the room, I have my own experiences with rare disease in my family. And it really is because of all of our stories, our collective stories, that we're here, and that we need to take a moment to examine and celebrate the progress that we've made over the last 40 years. But we owe it to this generation of rare disease patients to not plan for the next 40 years. Well, we do need to plan for the next 40 years, but to not just plan for the next 40 years. We really need to seize the opportunities that are in front of us today. And my job today is to wrap things up and talk about some of those policy opportunities that are in front of us. Just highlight a few of those. So what are those opportunities in front of us today? First and foremost, protecting those existing incentives that you've heard about today, those incentives that were passed as part of the Orphan Drug Act 40 years ago. Those incentives, such as the Orphan Drug Tax Credit, have already been reduced in some ways. The original credit was 50%. It was reduced to 25%. There have been conversations in the past about limiting that tax credit even more. We can't go back. We are here to talk about how we go forward. First and foremost, we need to protect the incentives that exist today. But we can't stop there. We need to make sure that we are not limiting the incentives that are out there artificially
especially in the area of finding new uses for already approved drugs. This goes along with what you heard about from Ben. And the fact that an unintended consequence that was built into the Inflation Reduction Act has the impact of limiting the incentive to invest in repurposed drug research. And that is not only not good for patients, it's letting policy drive, the innovation rather than really where the science is and what's most efficient for patients. We also need to protect and strengthen the accelerated approval pathway. The user fee process this year brought to light a number of ways, a number of consensus policies that we feel like makes sense to help tighten up and strengthen the accelerated approval pathway for especially for the use in rare diseases. We want to see that strengthened and grown. How can we unleash the potential of the accelerated approval pathway? But first and foremost, we need to get those pieces of the user fee bill that haven't made it across the finish line. Next, we can do more to invest in improving our understanding of rare diseases, natural history, clinical trial conduct, endpoint design, and otherwise, regulatory science challenges. The main way that this is done right now, Congress appropriates money for the FDA's Orphan Products Grant Program. That grant program is a critical resource for the rare disease community. It funds areas that have very limited resources otherwise, and it is filling a unique niche. Yet the funding has been flat for years. It is not funded up to its full authorization, and the program has demonstrated the need greatly outweighs the available resources that they have every year to invest. We can do more, and we know that the need is out there. This is a relatively small amount of money in the big picture, and we know we need to do more for this program. We can do more in the area of patient-focused drug development. We have really made tremendous progress over the last decade plus in centering the patient perspective in the drug development process. But what hasn't happened is we haven't carried that information through to the regulatory decision-making into the access environments as well. So how can we come together, and you heard about this from Congresswoman Matsui in the Benefit Act, how can we do more to make sure that that information is not just collected as part of the process and guiding company efforts, but it's actually used in the regulatory decision-making as it applies to the benefit risk framework. And lastly, we can do more to facilitate earlier communication between regulators and payers and sponsors. We know that earlier communication is an idea that is endorsed by the House. It was recognized in the user fee bill in section 810, where they had set out some clarifying guidelines for what type of communication can occur. But we also know that we can go beyond that, as we had proposed in the STAT Act, to actually formalize this communication process, create a third-party payer program, much like the Centers for Devices have. It's voluntary. It is meant to enable stronger clinical trial design, stronger education of payers, so that we come out on the end of a decision with more informed payers that can make quicker access decisions and more appropriate access decisions for the community. So these are just a few of the issues facing rare disease therapeutic development today. They're certainly not all of them, but we know that we're here today to talk about therapeutic development, and we wanted to highlight just a few of the ways, not 40 years from now, but today, next year, that you all can take action and get behind these common sense ways to advance outcomes for rare disease patients. So happy to answer any questions after we kick off the Q&A, but thank you for listening.
You said Q&A, and we were supposed to end that, I thought, at 1. Yeah, so I don't think, I think that we might not have time for Q&A, but we had the benefit of all your presentations, so they were all wonderful. And so we appreciate all that. You know, that 40 years ago, it was hard to imagine that the law that came about because of the picture that was shown with Abby Myers and there was Marjorie Guthrie, who was Woody Guthrie, the folk singer's widow. He had died of Huntington's disease, and so she took it as a cause, and it was really a cause. And our voice as a rare disease community was kind of being coalesced at around the same time as the AIDS community was recognizing it had a problem and was beginning to find its voice and begin to work with people in Washington, here on the Hill and in the federal agencies like Tony Fauci, to be able to convert HIV/AIDS from being a death sentence into a chronic disease. We quite haven't gotten this far. You know, as you've heard from many people, still 95% of conditions are without an approved therapy. And guess what? We're not catching up because we're discovering new rare conditions at a rate faster than we're approving new therapies. We're losing the race right now. So when you hear people like Christina Mike, and we didn't talk ahead of time, so this is not orchestrated, but when you hear Christina talk about Orphan Drug Act 2.0, because we have so much more that needs to be done. And you hear us talk about, you know, that from Ben about how the IRA is a disincentive then for repurposing and for finding new uses for already approved drugs. You know we have lots of work to do as a community. And so even though we're here celebrating a wonderful act that came out of Congress, 40 years ago, but we're also here to call to arms. It's a call for us to do more because it's up to us, because we have to go out there and essentially heal the world one person at a time. And the way to do that is through our collective power, to work with the men and the women of Congress to be able to come up with better things to address these issues. And also, like Christina said, the Orphan Drug Act 2.0 and what Ben said about an IRA exemption. So thank you all for being here to celebrate 40 years of tremendous progress, recognition that we exist so that we are not unknown orphans, but we are at least recognized and we have a voice when we speak as one. So thank you for being here and forward. Thank you.